I was about 8 or 9 when I conceived the ambition of being at the very least a competent writer and a well-read person. I'm about to turn 30 now, so I guess let's call it 20 years. I think the only problem with those ambitions, which isn't to slight them, they're very good goals, is just how related every book is to many others, maybe even all others. Per the law of analogy and the actual genealogy of thought of who preceded what giant shoulders are we standing upon. It's very difficult to fully appreciate any given author without also dealing with what surrounds them and made them possible. And that's not to say that you need to know their life story, because I'm of the old school that the art is supreme, the artist is secondary. But I'm referring to, for example, just how difficult it is to get a full grasp on Nietzsche and what he did, what he accomplished, without first having a fairly adequate grasp on Schopenhauer and the Bible. Nietzsche's philosophizing with a hammer. To read him alone is to see the hammer but not what it's smashing. And perhaps to be unable to appreciate whether you personally truly agree with if those things deserve to be smashed. And while there's certainly nothing wrong with reading the King James and Schopenhauer, in fact, I do recommend it to anyone who's a natural-born literati of some kind, it's undeniable that that's a whole lot of time and energy if your only goal is to be able to fully appreciate Friedrich, right? So, the one and only solution that I've found to this issue is that there are some authors and some books that truly curate, encapsulate, and summarize an entire field within themselves, or at least an entire theme or subject, to the point that they save you a whole lot of time and energy of needing to get through everything that came before you can deal with your original objective. For that reason, I thought I might make this a bit like a open letter to any young readers or aspiring writers. Of my recommendations on where you could put in minimal effort but reap maximum reward. So, where to begin? I think before I recommend you any particular titles to put in the Amazon or eBay shopping cart, I might first address my belief that when it comes to all of human thought, the history of ideas, particularly philosophy, but philosophy that is not purely academic. I'm referring to a philosophy that is like the foundation for everything that we then do. And in this sense, it is the parent of all other fields. It seems to me that there are these three thoughts that two of them are almost as old as recorded history, and the third is the explanation for the radical changes that began certainly post-World War II. Probably they became hyper-visible in the 60s. And now the idea has effectively become the core presupposition of the Western developed world. So, in brief, I'll discuss those three ideas, and then we'll get to some titles for you. The first idea we could call the Platonic idea. And of course, Plato, and perhaps Socrates, if he existed, contributed many different interesting and useful thoughts. But the one that is most predominant for Plato, the one that if we took it away, Plato would not really be himself anymore, is what is commonly referred to as the world of forms. But almost every definition I've ever encountered, certainly in a textbook context, and oftentimes in philosophical summaries as well, it seems to me that they somewhat miss the heart of it. They talk about it as though Plato is creating a thought experiment similar to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. There's no particular reason to believe that Nietzsche believed in eternal recurrence or thought it objectively true. Rather, he was using it to prove a point about how one could become impervious to resentment. So, world of forms, in truth, differs, in my opinion, in that it is not a thought experiment. Plato literally believed it and found the idea to be fundamental to everything else. And the thought is this: that if I look at the tree behind me or the birds above me, and I say this or that is beautiful, that may not just be a subjective eye of the beholder type expression, purely my own opinion. It may actually be objectively true, in so much as beauty itself, with a capital B, exists in this metaphysical realm that we call the world of forms. And everything that is beautiful is only beautiful because it reflects the form of beauty, like a mirror or a shadow. So beauty exists before time, before and after any of us will exist or be conscious. And when we see something beautiful, and when we find that almost all of humanity would tend to agree with us, and we find that there are many a defensible argument for saying that this thing is beautiful in a non-arbitrary way, that is because that thing has a spark of capital B beauty within it. In this sense, Plato's world of forms is both a fundamental thought to all spirituality and religion, including before he ever wrote it down for us. But it is also where our thought that perhaps all of this is just some simulation comes from. I think I had better stop there, lest this go off into some Baudrillard territory, but you will find as you read more and more, especially if you have any motivation to read the religions, the mystics, the occultists, all of this, that you cannot do without this Platonic idea. In fact, we might say that this is the spiritual idea in contrast to the secular idea. The second thought, very much related to the Platonic one, is the idea of a soul, which I don't need to dwell on very much, because everyone at least generally gets the gist of what is meant by soul. Something that, at the very least, might survive us after we die, but most likely also existed before we were ever born. But the particular nuance that I would like to zoom in on with this thought of the soul is that several scholars have found this phrase that recurs over and over again in the source texts, and then is sometimes called other things as well, such as the body of light or the resurrection body or something like this. But the phrase most famously used both by Julius Evola and by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa quite a long while before Evola, is the soul which stands, or the soul with the strength to stand. And this phrase encapsulates the concept that just because one may have a soul does not necessarily mean that they are therefore automatically immortal. Appending this concept of being able to stand, meaning in the other world, the afterlife, perhaps Plato's world of forms, was probably put best by Agrippa. He said, "A soul may live on after the body dies, but it is not immortal unless it be united with the divine mind." Once again, we have no choice but to refer back to the Platonic idea. If one wishes to be immortal, they must in some sense have become a reflection of that which is immortal, immortality, capital I. So this thought is where Plato's metaphysic of the world of forms becomes personal, becomes exceedingly relevant to one's own fate, and perhaps even the fate of humanity itself. Indeed, taking the two ideas together, we now have the full concept of spirituality and religion, which is that we enter this world, which is but a reflection or growth or child of the true world. And we're vested with many precious things, such as our own mind and our own soul. But those personal things will not last, will not have ultimate relevance, and have, in some sense, fulfilled their destiny unless they become united to the real world. In the Bible, there are a great deal of phrases that describe this, but perhaps one of the best is from Paul when he says, "Let there be less of me and more of you," referring to God. And even Jesus, in his hour of suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said to God in prayer, "Would that this cup, this fate, pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done." All of these phrases and many, many more are just a restatement of the Platonic idea and the soul with the strength to stand idea. Finally, we reach the third thought, which is where secularism, especially post-World War II, post-60s, but it had already begun to happen, late 1700s. These things take a while to get rolling. And this thought is basically just a negation of those other two. Nietzsche said it perhaps most clearly when he wrote that there are no facts, there are only interpretations. In other words, there is no objective form, or true world, or destiny, or God. There's only our opinions as mortal apes as we bumble about on the space rock. But the funny thing about this idea and its equally massive host of restatements is that what it really means is the truth is that there is no truth. Which, if you ask me, is one heck of a paradox. And it begs the question, what exactly is the point of saying it, much less arguing it? If you truly believe that we find ourselves in a fluke of a physical cosmos wherein we can never really know anything, our so-called epistemology is entirely empty and pointless, why bother with it? I mean, it reminds one of a scene in True Detective Season 1 where Rust Cole is going on one of his rants against religious believers. And Marty has one of his few intelligent moments in the show by effectively questioning what I just have. He says, I don't remember the exact quote, but Woody Harrelson's character effectively says, "Why are you so worried about it? You sound panicked." Quite a dilemma. Anyway, with a full appreciation of these three thoughts, and indeed the first two are so close together that we might call it just two, the spiritual thought and the secular thought. It is my belief that you will find as you begin to read more and more that these two underlie absolutely everything. If there is a story or a narrative arc to human thought, these are hero and villain, and you get to pick which is which. So, now that I've meandered around long enough, I'll suggest to you some specific titles that I think are an excellent base for any other reading that you would like to do going forward. But I will just preface again that though these do curate and summarize entire fields to the point that you might be able to not read the source materials that they're dealing with, there will still be bumpy spots where they're using certain words, certain phrases, making certain assumptions as to what you, the reader, may know that may not be accurate. But that's okay. Just to give one silly example, occasionally people are embarrassed when they make a video like this and they say a particular word or name and they pronounce the word or name incorrectly. And of course the comments are quick to let them know that they did so. Well, the fact that that happens is actually a compliment to the person. It means you are reading so widely that you are touching upon these territories that you have never heard anyone say at the dinner table, so on and so forth. So, bit of a silly example, but hopefully you get my gist. The first book that I recommend is The Tao Te Ching, T-A-O-D-A-O, by Lao Tzu. Particularly the translation by Brian Brown Walker. And that is because better than any book on Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., this book entirely encapsulates Eastern thought in so much as it differs from Western thought. The main takeaways from the Tao, at least in a utilitarian sense, are that sometimes inaction is better than action, and oftentimes subtlety is better than force. And I think as you continue to read more, you will see that these are indeed great differentiations between Eastern and Western philosophy. The second book that I would recommend is called The Apologies by G.K. Chesterton. And better than any other book, it is a holistic summary of biblical and Christian culture and values, to the extent that you could almost say that one could entirely skip having read the King James and still fundamentally appreciate everything that was brought forth by it. And even for those of you who may have an inherent bias against the Christian and the biblical, I would still ask that you give Chesterton's Apologies a try. Not necessarily because I think that he will convert you, but because Chesterton, better than any other author that I have ever seen, and it really isn't even close, bestows a sense of joy and a love of humanity in general that is unequaled. He is akin to a mythological figure like Santa Claus in terms of being jolly and humorous, but doing so and being so in an entirely serious and sincere fashion. And so for those great compliments and many others, I strongly recommend Chesterton's Apologies. The next book is a book that I would only recommend to people who really want to go deep on the Platonic and the standing soul concepts, which is certainly not everyone, and it's probably a very small minority. But the book is Initiation into Hermetics by Franz Bardon. Two caveats before you pick up IIH, as people refer to it. The first is, it is not a book to be read. It is a book to be practiced. It is a kind of cosmic to-do list. And the second is, it would be a massive mistake to attempt to undergo this to-do list if there is anything particularly traumatic that is, for lack of a better term, haunting your life. Please keep that in mind. You could always save this one for the end of the list, and that would probably be best. The next two books, I group them together, are what I would call summaries of human nature. And this is a funny term because the secular thought somewhat united with things such as the Soviet New Man or B.F. Skinner's psychological work typically supposes that really there is no such thing as human nature. We're all Skinner's blank slate when we enter the world, and we are what society and culture makes of us. So these two books may potentially challenge that assumption if you already hold it. But whether you do or don't, they're incredibly valuable. The first is called On Killing by Grossman, and it is not nearly as morbid as the title would make you think. It is an incredible tour de force on the realities of violence throughout human history and how average human beings deal with it, cope with it, rationalize it, so on and so forth. And the second is called Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan. And it is, I suppose it's technically evolutionary psychology, but it's a look at primitive lifestyle and perhaps an answer to why it seems like people are cracking up at a record rate now that we're the farthest from the primitive lifestyle as we've ever been. The next pairing, I'll go through these a little bit more quickly since we've already been going a while, is a boxed set that is just called Bushcraft by Canterbury. I think it's 4 books in the box set, but if you search Bushcraft Canterbury and you see a box set, that's what I'm talking about. And the reason why I recommend this is that even if you have no plans of leaving the concrete jungle anytime soon, reading this book will teach you what the real world is. Meaning not the metaphysical one, but this one that I'm currently surrounded by. And in so doing, it will teach you perhaps what real human beings are and were before we began inventing new problems for ourselves in the form of the internet and whatnot. And the second of the pair, I pair these together because I consider them both to be 2 sides of the same coin that is survival and prospering against the odds, is called Buffett and Soros by Mark Tier. That's referring to Warren Buffett and George Soros, the investors. And the title of that book is actually longer, but if you search Mark Tier, T-I-E-R, you'll find it. You'll know the one that I'm referring to. And the reason I recommend it is because if Canterbury teaches us how to survive in the primitive world, Mark Tier has somehow managed to completely summarize the topic of wealth and money in a way, I think, unequaled by any other. Finally, then, that just leaves me with a optional trilogy for anyone who, in addition to having a good grasp on what literature has to offer, because again, my view is literature is rarely for its own sake, it's because it enriches everything else about life. But if you do wish to be part of the literati and become a great writer and potentially have something to add to this corpus eventually, I would start with Writing Down the Bones by Goldberg. Excellent general summary of what good writing is and how to do it. The next would be The Secrets to Writing Great Comedy by Bone, B-O-W-N. I think it's Leslie Bone, B-O-W-N. The only book I've encountered that can actually teach one how to be funny, especially through practice. And then the third and last would be Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke, the poet. And the reason why I say last is because Letters to a Young Poet serves as a sort of jumping off point into originality. And this should come last because, as Nietzsche famously said, you need to learn the rules before you endeavor to break them. I may disagree with Nietzsche on quite a lot, but he absolutely nailed it with that one. So, with that, I think we conclude my little book recommendation list for you. I hope that it helps. Hope you derive great value and success from the time and energy and money that it will take to acquire those titles. And I would love to hear from any of you if you agree or disagree with my choices, preferably after you've read them. And I hope that this reading, this writing, this literary side of the world will be a blessing to you holistically, to your entire life. God bless. Signing off.